Hi, I'm Paul. Welcome back for another Blazor Brief, this time regarding the use of B.E.M. What is B.E.M? Quite simply, B.E.M is a naming convention for organising CSS classes in a structured and modular way. I can say from my own personal experience that adopting B.E.M has made it much easier for me when developing Blazor components, as it takes away the pain of trying to name and organise CSS. B.E.M is super easy, and to be honest, the hardest part for me was not B.E.M, but my own structured way of trying to organise things in a way that mirrored the physical implementation, instead of just structuring things logically without reliance on the underlying structure of the HTML elements. B.E.M stands for Block Element Modifier. A block is a standalone thing. I think of this as a component. An element is part of a component that would not have a specific meaning on its own and should not be created to stand on its own. Its purpose is to be part of a block. A modifier is just that, something that modifies a block or a block element. On screen is an example of an input component which I quickly created in Blazor. Both the CSS and Blazor component in total took about an hour to produce. I built them just so you could see all of the parts involved and how B.E.M is not complex as long as you don't overthink things. I'm from the UK, and here in the UK there's a game show called Catchphrase, where you have to guess a catchphrase based on a picture, with the picture being hidden by 9 square panels which slowly get removed. The game is not difficult, and the host always says, "Just say what you see." Once you get used to B.E.M, it's not dissimilar in that respect. Just use sensible names and don't try to include or imply what the physical structure is, as otherwise you will go round in circles. Trust me, that's a mistake I made when I first started using B.E.M. So as noted on screen, during conception, i.e. what was in my head at the time, I saw a text input component with an icon on one side of the input and another icon on the other side for state information, such as whether the input was valid, invalid, or read-only. I also wanted information on screen about whether the input was required and a hint regarding the type of data required. Before I even added any HTML or CSS, I was thinking, okay, I need a text input component, the block part of B.E.M. The component needs a field label, a block element in B.E.M, an icon element, an input element, a state element, and another element for the hint about the input data. I knew styles would change based on state, when the input was valid or invalid, so the only difficult part, if you can even call it that, was deciding what B.E.M modifiers I would need, and whether those modifiers should be element modifiers or block modifiers. I wasn't sure what styles I would be changing. I only knew that I wanted a check mark or a cross-coloured green or red to depict the different states. I knew accessibility would be covered by just toggling area attributes for state, so these styles were just for visual enhancements. Rather than use separate B.E.M modifiers for individual elements, I opted to create a single modifier for the block and use that to target the elements that I wanted to change, which in this case I felt was the best option. The first thing I did before writing the HTML was just to create an empty sassy CSS partial file for the text input component and add the empty classes, the ones listed on screen. I then just added these to the HTML markup while creating the component. This process was pretty easy, as I had used a similar design before, so I knew in my head I would just use a 3-column, 3-row CSS grid for the layout. So basically, that's all I did. Let's remove the CSS and re-add it using the class names on screen, so you have a sense of what was involved. To do that, bear one thing in mind. At no point, other than me mentioning a CSS grid, have we been concerned about the physical HTML elements or the structure of those elements. Our only concerns have been about the component and the elements that make up that component. If you understand this point, then you will find B.E.M a doddle to use if you choose to do so. I first created the class for the text input component, adding an inline 3-column, 3-row grid. I used min content for the width of the first grid column as I made the input icon optional, and using a min content would allow the input to take that column space if it wasn't used. The viewport width of 40 was only added just for the demo, as I did not use any CSS layout on the home page. I just dropped a couple of text component inputs on the page and called it a day. I then just completed the styles for the elements, making sure that they were placed in the correct grid cell. There is nothing noteworthy about the CSS, it's just simple stuff, margins, padding and colours. As I am using Sassy CSS, a CSS preprocessor, the only thing that you may find of interest is using the @extend directive with a placeholder. Basically, this allowed me just to toggle icons without using any icon classes. By default, the state info element would display a green color checkmark using an SVG icon marked as a placeholder. I could then change this icon to any other using the block modifier to target the state info element. When there is an invalid modifier, I just use another SVG icon marked as a placeholder, this time a cross which I color red. I also use the invalid modifier to target the optional user supplied icon to change its color to red as well. Although I understand that CSS can be a little intimidating at times, taking the time to learn Sassy CSS enough to get by and then B.E.M totally changed my view on things. When I get the time, I will make a video about creating your own CSS framework, as once you start using Sassy CSS it really is a doddle to make your own. What do we get by using B.E.M? Well, we gain some sensible names that describes the CSS and HTML for one, and I will quite happily spend a few extra bytes for that readability. As the block name forms part of each element name, we get a simple, non-cryptic scoping mechanism that keeps a cascade in cascading style sheets, meaning it's easy to override the classes if you ever have to, but hopefully if you need to add changes, you'll be able to simply add additional modifiers. One last thing before the video ends. One topic that seems to cause confusion is about blocks containing other blocks. Blocks can contain other blocks, as blocks are just standalone components. Using our text input component as an example, maybe I want to add 2 of these inside a form. Maybe it's one of those subscribe things with an input for your name and email and a button to submit the form, which could then be placed on numerous pages on the website. For argument's sake, let's call it a new subscription. So that's our block name. What elements do we need? We need a submit button, so we will have a new subscription _submit element. What about our text inputs? If they need their internals modifying, then it's a modifier for the text input block or block element as usual. Blocks only modify their own content. If it's say a spacing or an alignment issue within the new subscription block, then I would just add a new subscription _input element, placing that say on a div and then placing the text input components inside that div, which is being spaced or aligned by the new subscription element. Doing this means that each block remains completely isolated and reusable, negating conflicts and development headaches. Well, that wraps it up for this Blazor brief. As usual, feel free to leave comments or questions. Thanks for watching. Until next time, bye for now.